I feel like today may be especially short just given this topic. Because as I was looking through it, this is kind of a Mike's greatest hits of things he reiterates over and over and over again. So I don't know how much more I can beat this one home. But it deals with evaluating authors' reasoning and evidence. And more specifically, I don't know where they get these titles from. Right? But more specifically, it's can you differentiate fact from opinion, from judgments or conclusions, right? Which is, again, something I harp on a lot and something we talk about a lot, right? In the context of other subjects that we've gone over. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but at the same time, it's worth giving some amount of attention, just because I harp on it for a reason, hopefully, because it pops up on the test a lot. So I feel like we don't need to spend a whole lot of time discussing what facts are, what opinions are, what judgments or conclusions are. So I'll just read them real quick. Facts, information that can be proven to be true. Opinions, beliefs about a concept or situation. And judgments are conclusions that are supported by reasons and evidence. Okay. So if we look at these three options, just so we know kind of what we're dealing with. Here are three different statements. Guess what? One's going to be a fact, an opinion, and a judgment. You look at these three and pick out which one is which, right? So the first statement, and I'll just read through them all, and as I'm doing that, you can be reading them and deciding which ones you think are which. So number one says, because it raises the amount employers will pay in payroll taxes, the new tax bill may contribute to higher unemployment. Number two says, last year, manufacturing output in our state rose by 4.6% over the previous year. And three, we should limit the role played by the federal government in formulating energy policy for our region of the country. Okay, so you're, again, just joining us. We're just talking about facts, opinions, and judgments and kind of sorting out the difference between them, right? And so this ties into what we talked about yesterday, which was bias, point of view, and specifically looking at the way things are worded. Right? It's another one of my greats. And these social studies practices are like things you probably are sick of hearing me talk about. So I apologize. But again, we know what the difference between facts and opinions are. Conclusions are kind of a mix or a gray area where they're not fact-based, and it is somewhat of an opinion, but it's a conclusion that you arrive to based on some kind of information. Whereas an opinion can just be a belief thing. Right? It doesn't need to be supported by facts or evidence. We probably all have friends that have opinions that are completely wrong, especially according to us. But if we look at these statements, just the way they're worded can give away a lot, right? So it's probably easy to pick out the opinion here, right? Which one do you think the opinion is? 1, 2, or 3? And hopefully we agree that the opinion is number 3. We should limit the role played by the federal government in formulating energy policy for our region of the country. The fact the statement starts with the phrase "we should" means someone is telling us what they think we should do, right? So by definition, that's an opinion. Similarly, facts often include, first of all, they avoid words like should or could or may, and they tend to be more it does this, or something is that, or so they're stated a different way when we're talking about facts. They also tend to include numbers or statistics, right? So number 2 is our fact. Last year, manufacturing output in our state rose by 4.6% over the previous year. Okay? That is stated as a fact. Now, be careful, right? Because just because something is stated as fact doesn't necessarily mean it's true, right? Facts are just defined as information that can be proven to be true. Facts can also, people can state false facts, but the reason that we can still consider it factual is A, that's in the way it's stated, and B, we can research it to see if it's true. If number 2 is a false statement, what do we have to do? We just have to go and find whether or not manufacturing output in our state rose by 4.6% the previous year. If it did, that is verifiably true. And if we find that it isn't, we can go find that information, right? So number 2 is a fact. And then that leaves number 1 as our judgment or conclusion, which is usually they use the word conclusion. I don't know why they choose to use the word judgment today. But the statement says, because it raises the amount employers will pay in payroll taxes, the new tax bill may contribute to higher unemployment. So the key word there is may, right? It might. But also, there are kind of two chunks to that conclusion, right? The conclusion is saying, because A is true, or because we know this happened, then we think this probably should happen, right? Anytime you see something phrased in that way, it tends to be a conclusion or a judgment. I said I would stop harping on it and going over it too much, so let's just skip down, do some practice questions, and I'm sure I'll blab on about something as we go, and then just end when we end. Okay, so I'm going to skip that and just go down to the practice question. So let me look at number 1. So number 1 over here, based on this passage, which is like a consultant stating something. And the consultant says, a reliable energy supply is vital to developing a stable economy in Cambodia, a country still recovering from decades of civil war and genocide in the late 1970s. Millions of Cambodians were killed. Damming the Mekong River could solve Cambodia's energy supply problems. However, since the Mekong flows through China, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand before it reaches Cambodia, regional cooperation will be necessary. And the question just asks us, which of the following is an opinion and not a fact presented by the consultant? So find the opinion. A, damming the Mekong could solve Cambodia's energy problems. B, the Mekong River flows through several countries before reaching Cambodia. C, Cambodia experienced civil war. D, millions of Cambodians were killed in the late 1970s. So all 4 of those are statements pulled directly from the paragraph, right? Which one seems like an opinion? Now, this one doesn't stand out because it's not overly opinionated, but there's only one that uses the wording that we associate with opinions, and also doesn't contain anything that is something we can verify to be true. So for example, B, the Mekong River flows through several countries before reaching Cambodia. We know that. We can look on a map. We can see it flows through China, Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand. Okay, we can prove that to be true. C, Cambodia experienced civil war. We can find documents that prove that that was a thing that happened, right? D, millions of Cambodians were killed in the late 1970s. Again, if it's true, we can go look it up and we can figure out whether or not it's true. So the only one left is A, damming the Mekong could solve Cambodia's energy problem. Now, it uses could. It's not as strong of an opinion as some of the other examples, but it's still an opinion nonetheless, right? Because it's not something that can be verified to be true. This person's opinion that damming the river could help, could solve Cambodia's energy. All right, number 2. I like this question for some reason, probably because it's silly. So first, let's look at the picture before I zoom out too far. So number 2 is based on this cartoon, this political cartoon from the early 20th century, or the early 1900s, and it's a guy sitting up on an apple tree, cutting the branch off of it, and the saw has strike written on it. Think about what strikes are. What do we think a strike is? We know that or have some idea. And then the tree branch says production. Okay. So that alone is symbolic. So if the saw is representing a strike and the branch is representing production, strike is sawing right through the middle of it. Okay, so that's part of it. And then the other ironic part is where this person chooses to be sitting. Right? Seems to be maybe on the wrong part of the bridge. He cuts it down. What is he doing? Okay. So that's the analysis of kind of what we're looking at. Let's take a look at what the question's asking. I'll zoom out a little bit and let me know if this is too far zoomed. Okay. So, number 2 asks us, which of the following represents the viewpoint of the cartoonist, right? So, not necessarily opinion, fact, judgment related. Honestly, this is similar to the kind of questions we talked about yesterday. So, let's look through the 4. A, strikes can achieve better working conditions. B, strikes have a detrimental impact on workers. C, farm workers are more likely to engage in strikes than are factory workers. Or D, strikes should hamper production. Okay. So, can we agree on any of these that seem wrong? Or can you throw any of them out, right? So, for example, I would say A doesn't seem to fit with the cartoonist's general depiction of what's going on. Strikes can achieve better working conditions. It appears that this author or this cartoonist is not trying to show that strikes are beneficial. They're trying to show, they're painting strikes in a negative light, right? So I would say A doesn't fit at all. The other one I'd probably throw out would be C. Farm workers are more likely to engage in strikes than are factory workers. The person represented is a farmer of some kind, but there's nothing else in the picture that talks directly about farm workers or implies anything about farm workers versus factory workers or anything like that. Okay, so that doesn't appear to be a good fit either. So if we look at B and we look at D, they both fit to some degree, but what do you think is best? B says strikes have a detrimental impact on workers, and D says strikes should hamper production. Okay. Well, what do you think? I would say that if the picture was just a man sawing a branch, and if all we saw was a man sawing and we saw this part of it, right? The branch says production, the strike is cutting right through it. That implies D, that strikes are hampering production. Now, whether the author or the cartoonist thinks that they should, that's up for debate, but it's definitely implied that strikes stop production or hamper it or harm it in some way, right? But the real irony of the picture is what? It's where the guy is sitting. And so that implies that the striker or the farmer who's choosing to strike is doing what? Harming himself, right? Because when he cuts this branch off, what's going to happen? He's going to fall and he's going to hurt himself. So really, even more important than the part about the strike and the production is the fact that he's sitting out here. So B is actually the best answer, according to the GED. Strikes have a detrimental impact on work. They think the cartoonist is trying to say they think they're proving things or trying to improve their situation, but really all they're doing is hurting themselves. That's what this cartoon is. Okay, let's look at number 3. Hopefully that makes sense. Here's a pretty easy. All right, so number 3, moving my boxes around. Apparently. All right. So number 3, let's see that I'm frozen on the screen. Hopefully you can hear me okay. So number 3 says, ancient Greece was the greatest of the early civilization. While the Babylonians may have had arithmetic and ancient Egypt built the pyramids, ancient Greece gave us our first taste of democracy. Which of the following is a fact that the historian uses to support her opinion? Okay, so her opinion, and the opinion here is what? The opinion is ancient Greece was the greatest of the early civilization. That's an opinion that the historian had. So that automatically rules out A. Ancient Greece was the greatest early civilization. That is a fact that supports her opinion. That is her opinion. Okay, so A is wrong. Well, let's look at the other 3. Which of these facts help support her opinion? Okay, they're all 3 facts. They're all mentioned. Which one supports her opinion? Or think of it like when we talk about main idea and supporting detail, right? Supporting details support the main idea. Which one of these facts supports her opinion? B. Hey, there he is, special guest. Wow, man, if only we could have like a fake applause. Ah. Any words of wisdom for Allie or James?
Put your mouse on your computer and leave it there when you're trying to take off and leave for the day. And they just
Fair enough. Okay.
take care.
Adios. Okay. Yep, no problem. All right. Man, that was enough to send Allie packing. She hung up after that. Okay, well, apparently Sean scared off half of our students. All right, so back to looking at number 3 here. B, so we ruled out A. B says Babylonians made use of arithmetic. C, the pyramids were built in ancient Egypt. Or D, ancient Greece pioneered democracy. So again, all of these 3 are facts. Only one of them supports her opinion. And again, her opinion was that ancient Greece was the greatest early civilization. So, which one of those other 3 facts talk about ancient Greece? The only one is D, ancient Greece pioneered democracy. And in this historian's opinion, that makes them the greatest. Now, again, that is entirely opinion, but it's supported by this specific piece of factual information. Okay, make sense? And then the last question, number 4. Down. Number 4 is based on this chart here, and this chart compares the Articles of Confederation, which, if you weren't around when we were doing our civics and government section, Articles of Confederation were, and it says up here, predecessor to the U.S. Constitution. In other words, came before. So the Articles of Confederation were, or was our first attempt at drafting some kind of document that outlined how our country was going to be run, but it failed, and our country was going bankrupt, and after 10 years, they redid it, right? And created the Constitution, which we still have today. Okay? So this chart is just looking at and comparing the differences and, in some cases, similarities between the two. So go down the list, federal court systems. So the Articles of Confederation, there was no system of federal courts, meaning national courts, right? Courts were all state. The Constitution instituted a federal court system, that exists to deal with issues between citizens and between states. Regulating of trade. The Articles of Confederation, there was no provision to regulate interstate trade. The states could do whatever they wanted. And then the Constitution set up Congress and passed laws that regulated the way states could trade between each other. Executive power. The Articles of Confederation, in our first iteration of the United States, there was no executive with power. There was a president. Right? The president merely presided over Congress. So they were like the head of Congress, but they didn't have other duties. Okay? Whereas in the Constitution, the executive branch was made separate, and we have kind of our individualized branches of government. Armies. The Articles of Confederation, Congress could not draft troops, and they were dependent on states to contribute forces. So you notice the big difference is the Articles of Confederation had much less structure and much more power given to the states, whereas the Constitution shifted more power to the federal government, and states shared some of that power. But there was much more federal oversight with the Constitution. And that's a topic for another day in civics and government. And then, based on the Constitution, Congress could raise an army to deal with military situations. So it basically created a national armed forces, whereas before we just had individual state militias. Sovereignty, meaning what is a good way to define sovereignty? Power or freedom. So sovereignty resided in the states meant that the states didn't answer to anyone. They were their own power. They were their own entity. They worked together with other states, and we were still considered the United States of America, but each state had supreme authority in that state. Whereas the Constitution was set up so that the Constitution itself would be the supreme law, not necessarily just the state or the national government, right, but the document itself. And then taxes. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress could ask states to pay taxes, but they couldn't force them to. Whereas under the Constitution, the Congress has the right to levy taxes on individuals. In other words, impose taxes on them. So all of these changes were instituted essentially because the United States didn't have enough infrastructure to stay afloat. Right? The government was losing money because they cut taxes and so on and so forth. So again, there's the chart. Let's look at the question. I haven't even got to the question. Babbling on about this. So the question talks about conclusions or judgments and just says, which of the following is a conclusion supported by the table above rather than a detail stated in the table? So again, a conclusion is a judgment that we come to based on information from this chart, whereas a detail is something specifically mentioned in the chart. So sometimes with this, it's easiest to find the details, and then what's left is probably our answer. So A, the Constitution allows Congress to enforce collection of taxes, whereas the Articles of Confederation do not. It's a detail, right? We can look and see right here that that's the case, so A is not correct. B, the Constitution grants more power to the federal government than did the Articles of Confederation. That's something that I kind of mentioned. That isn't something stated anywhere on here, so that seems like the right answer. Okay, but let's look at the other two real fast. C, there were no national armed forces before the Constitution was drafted. True, we can look on there and see that. And D, trade was not nationally regulated by the Articles of Confederation. Also, detail from the chart. So B is our right answer. Nowhere here does it say that the federal government has more power under the Constitution. But as we read it, we can see that it's obvious, it's a conclusion that can clearly be made, that the Constitution gives more power to the federal government then did the Articles of Confederation, which essentially gave all the power to the state. So, kind of makes sense? Tomorrow, let's see. Oh, tomorrow's Friday. No class. So that's all I've got for social studies for the week. We'll wrap up this little section of science or social studies practices next week. And remember, we've got a couple weeks off for class after next week. So next week is the last week of class for just a little while, and then we'll be back the 1st of July with new classes. So again, make sure you're staying connected so that we can let everyone know what classes are going to look like when we come back in July. They may be the same, they may be different. So anyway, just make sure you're staying in contact with us so that we can let you know what the latest is on classes. So that's all I've got for today. If you have any questions, feel free to email me, and otherwise,